Yes, the microphone, please. Thank you. Otherwise, we won't be able to hear you. Many thanks.
Thank you so much. My name is Charmill Zamuee, and I've been tasked to actually indicate what my short-term as well as my long-term goals, strategic interventions would be in terms of my contribution to the city of Windhoek as a smart and caring city. Okay, yes. Okay, just in a nutshell, when one looks in terms of what the mandate of a CEO is, we need to look at what is a mandate in terms of the Local Authority Act, and with that is that we're supposed to provide basic services, and not forgetting that City of Windhoek is a service delivery organization. And with that comes that crucial part that stakeholder engagement is actually crucial to the sustainability of this organization. And therefore, my strategy will basically look at the process flow, efficiency, and how best we can actually deliver customer service. And with that, my leadership style is based on servanthood and transformational leadership. So with that, I'm going to be looking into value stream mapping in terms of processes, and looking in terms of flow, in terms of efficiencies, and check and balance. And that again brings back to the repeat, which is continuous assessment, that is nothing else but agility, flexibility, and innovative strategies in terms of moving the city forward. Okay, in terms of compliance, the first key point, which in terms of my short term within the 100 days that I'm going to be tackling with, is the issue of the Auditor General's report that actually qualified the city in terms of that they were not compliant with sound labor practices. And that talks to efficiency and customer services as well. And I went ahead and looked at the council meeting of April 2021. And through going through that report, what came forth was, one, that the processes within the city of Windhoek are not aligned with human capital. And what I mean with that is, in order to establish services, one needs to look at the human capital, your employees that are working for you. I mean, these are human beings, and most of the services provided by the city is not automated. So it's physical people going to do the work. And based on the number on that council report, actually was alarming in the sense that if you have that number of employees and the number of residents in Windhoek, it really doesn't tally, which means that it's putting pressure on the employee, because you've got one employee servicing about roughly 230 residents. I mean, that's totally unacceptable. And it's one thing that one needs to look at, which actually talks to that the city is understaffed. And the fact that 40% of turnover is paid to employees actually is a red flag, in the sense that it's a lot of money. And that talks to that you actually overpaying, and that talks then back to the compliance, why we really have that. So one need to want to lean to streamline human resources capabilities in terms of looking in-house in terms of what are the skills, qualifications that we have, what sort of people do we have, and what sort of succession planning do we intend to have. And in terms of external, when it comes to that, is that the public needs to actually be aware of it, because I wasn't, and it was an eye-opening. So the first 100 days, I will engage with stakeholders to understand what their needs are. And also in terms of efficiency, because we cannot want to render services if we do not have the capacity and we don't know what the needs are. And as I said, the city is a service organization, so human capital is very, very important. Just a minute, I need a bit of coffee. Okay, and my next point is in social entrepreneurship. As we know, we are in a bit of a current economic situation that is not favorable to a lot of people. We've got high unemployment rates, and especially with the youth. So in terms of looking at that, one needs to look in terms of collaboration programs that targets youth engagements. And I know that the city has done a lot in terms of running programs where they have plumbers and all these artisan programs where they take in cohorts to actually give them the experience, but it's not sustainable because what happens is they just go on to take on the next group, and the group that has had the skills and the qualification actually left in limbo. So one needs to really look in terms of how can we engage the businesses and so on to see if there is a collaboration where we can actually kind of collaborate in this type of things. And also this issue of social entrepreneurship is not just based on Windhoek, it's a national problem. So I would love to work with council, civic societies, businesses, and line ministry as well. And also the one issue that the mayor also has highlighted was the issue of neighborhood leadership, which I think is something that absolutely will capitalize on that, to be able to create a culture of knowledge sharing within the residents of Windhoek, and that to empower local communities with basic skill to help them foster self-sufficiency. And one of my favorite is cost management. The city has so far never had a clean audit. And in terms of financial sustainability is something that is guided by budgets. So if you do not honor the budget and you do not comply with what the basic processes, it actually brings problem. So my plan is to be able to achieve this through putting structures in place. And these structures would then mean proper record keeping, full audit inventory, because that is one of the things that also qualified the city based on the financial reports. And then also one of the other issues was that the city did not have an updated asset register, which is really, really dangerous, because how do you keep track and how do you keep people accountable if you don't even know what you own and how much it is? So that in itself is an absolute thing that one needs to work at. And the other issue is then to ensure accountability. And with that, you leverage on powers that we have. What is the capacity in terms of the people within the financial department? How can we then leverage on the skills that they have, and how best to put these processes in place and to actually minimize on the silos that we have? So what is it that I can offer that the other department can actually use? And in that sense, we then collaborate. So my plan of action is to have a clean audit within the first 2 to 3 years within employment. And the thorny issue here, although it has political connotations to it, is the issue of accelerated land delivery. I was born and bred in Windhoek, and I know how it actually feel like to grow into a very poor neighborhood with minimum resources. So as CEO, my mandate is to really act on the mandate of the local authority, that everybody has a place to stay. And with that, one also need to take very big cognizant of the fact that we've got financial barriers to that as well, because of budgets and so on. So one needs to also take that into account and also look at internal capacity. What is it that we have that we can leverage on, where we can get money to be able to service this, and look at areas where we can improve, where can we add value, call on public-private partnership to help with servicing of these lands. And with that, we reduce wastages and leakages within this whole process. And that will actually in itself minimize the rapid urban migration that Windhoek is currently experiencing, because everybody is coming to Windhoek because of employment opportunities and so on. So if we can empower the other local municipalities to make their towns also equally attractive, that will minimize that influx of people coming to Windhoek, because they will have pride in their own towns, and at least Windhoek can breathe a bit. So that will then also mean that I'll be putting structures in place to ensure levels of transparency throughout this whole process of land delivery, and there has to be accountability and proper governance structures to it. So I'm actually looking forward to working with you as the new CEO, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We did good on time. So let's invite some questions. Members of the the panel can ask question. Councillors present, you are allowed to ask questions. The observer representing NAPU, you're also allowed to ask questions while we wait for questions from members of the public. Do we have an indication of a question? Any question? Was the presentation so clear that we don't have questions? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Charmill, for the good presentation. For me, it's most of a clarity. When you were talking about human capital, you mentioned that there is not enough staff to service the current capacity of the consumer. But on the other side, you also mentioned about red flags in terms of overpaying. So if you talk about there is no capacity, yet on the other hand, you are talking about red flags in terms of overpaying, what exactly are you referring to? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Do we take some more, or do we allow Ms. Zamuee to respond to that question? Okay, Ms. Zamuee.
She had her hand up.
Okay, yes.
The thing is actually twofold. Thank you, Ms. Kali. What I did is I took the number of employees as indicated by the council report, that meeting report that they had in April, and I looked at the number of residents that is in Windhoek. And as a ratio, I was looking at if we have this number of employees to service this number of residents, and in terms of efficiency, how much workload, and I was looking at it from that perspective. If one have to put processes in place, you need to understand what is our capacity within the city of Windhoek to be able to actually provide those type of services. And if you look at one person for 230, that actually is an overburden, and it actually kind of explain why you would have a 40%, because that will probably then talk to maybe overtime or so, because you've got shortages of staff. So in any event, you will not have a balance, because if you have fewer employees, you're gonna put more pressures in terms of time and resources as well. So I don't know, I'm not within the city, but this is the numbers that was on that report. So 40% for me of turnover is not sustainable for starters, because you cannot run an organization on 60%. It really is not sustainable at all. So one needs to look at that. If it's an issue of recruitment, then one needs to really investigate and see where the problem lies. But 40% of turnover is extremely high. The average acceptable percentage is 25 to 30% of turnover.
Thank you. Maybe just a follow-up.
Yes.
Is your thinking then to add additional capacity, or is there other intervention you would like to employ?
What I would love to do is to first understand what is at hand. How many employees do we have, and in which departments are they, and how are they equipped in those different departments? And then from there, one can take an action to say this is the way forward, after understanding what the actual problem is, or why we have a ratio of one person serving 230 residents. Because I mean, these are human beings, so it also talks to their motivation, and also probably why some people are always complaining about the service levels, because really then they absolutely no capacity.
Okay. Any other question? Well, Ms. Zamuee, you might actually become very unpopular as a CEO if the idea is to reduce people's salary in order to accommodate more people, in order for the community to be saved. What would you respond to that?
No, I think that is just a misunderstanding, because one needs to look at it in terms of ratio. You want sustainability. So I'm not saying that we need to reduce people's salary. I'm saying I'm looking at it from the human perspective, because these are human beings. We're talking people with families. So if they have to work overtime, what sort of service will they give to the next person the next day? So their well-being is actually very crucial for me, very important. So you want to have happy employees to be able to render the service and at the acceptable levels that is actually required.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Advocate Walters?
Thank you. Ma'am, you are aware that you cannot implement your ideas, your interventions without the approval of council. Now, how would you convince, what will you do to convince council to buy into your ideas and your interventions?
Thank you, Advocate Walters. In terms of, there's a clear mandate in terms of what the CEO role is, and that is to execute the mandate of council, first and foremost. And with that is, one needs to then also work in terms of what is it that the CEO is required to do. So you act within that mandate. And I mean, this issue of that came up, the three issues that actually came up is things that came up from the General Auditor's report and also from the council meeting itself. So it's not something outside. It's all based in all interpretations based on council meetings and on the Auditor General report and recommendations for action.
Thank you for that intervention. Do we have any additional questions? Yes. Mr. Benjamin?
Thank you very much, Mr. Zamuee. In your presentation, you refer to addressing the land question in Windhoek in a collaborative stakeholder approach.
Yes.
Can you share with us who are these stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders the cities can work with to address land delivery?
Okay. In terms of stakeholders, we know that the stakeholders basically is employees, is the council, government, civic society, businesses. So one is to look in terms of how can they actually help. And this is one of a good example of corporate social responsibility initiatives that can come in to say, how can we help you? Because this is not just a city of Windhoek problem. This is a national problem. And people need land, people need homes. So how can we then accelerate this? How can we work in terms of creating social development programs in order, and also responsibilities from businesses to be able to help us with this problem? And I mean, land is a gold mine, as they say. So within that, one can also look in how can we leverage if we have to work on these private PPPs to benefit everybody. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, Ms. Martins, Ausiko.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zamuee. Thank you for your presentation. I must say, I saw some brilliant ideas coming through, but what I didn't get is the how. So I'm going to zoom in on one of them. For instance, you mentioned that we need to empower other local authorities to make their towns attractive. Maybe one or two initiatives. How are we going to do that? Or how will you do that? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of that, it's three things that actually can pop up in my mind. The one was the issue, I think it was mentioned, I can't remember the time, but it was mentioned by a suggestion that was made by the mayor at the time, Dr. Mpanda, in terms of knowledge sharing and in terms of, because Windhoek currently is in the first year, if you look in terms of Walvis Bay and Swakopmund, they are one of the biggest municipality and they've got the expertise. For example, in terms of services, so I mean the smaller towns, if we can invest and have our people render services to the smaller municipality, not only are we impacting knowledge onto them, we're also delivering a service, and with that we're also generating an income, and with that is also creating sustainability within those smaller municipalities to actually be sustainable in the long run and to also retain their own residents, not for them to flock out and to create ghost towns.
How? Give me an example. I want to really understand this concept. It's quite an interesting one. And what services and how will you go about doing it? Just an example so that I can grasp it.
Okay. Let's make it clear now. If you look at town planning, for example, I mean, the smaller towns, they're not as equipped as Windhoek is, and we've got the infrastructure and we've got the know-how. So in terms of that, some of our employees will then go over to them and do the training, assess, because currently what's happening is that the people outsourcing those type of services. So we're then just asking them, in terms of outsourcing, could the first option not be the nearest municipality that can actually offer those type of services? And then just see then from there, how can you then best make use of it?
Thank you. Now, on rapid rural urban migration, some would say there isn't much anybody can do about this phenomenon because it's become a worldwide phenomenon to the extent that people who are living in rural areas are leaving these rural areas because of push and pull factors. And they are abandoning and voting with their feet by joining the cities. Some would say that what is required is that the city fathers must basically just pull up their socks and make sure that they can cater for a large influx of some of these people. To this, you say what?
Can you repeat that again?
Rapid urbanization is considered to be a worldwide phenomenon. And it's not really about, this is what some people would say, it's not really about whether there are services within these rural areas or not. People simply just want to live in cities, to the extent that it is now being requested that city fathers must plan correctly in order to cater for the large influx of people leaving their rural areas to cities.
That is true, but the major issue of urbanization is poverty. And poverty is a lifelong thing that we cannot actually eradicate within the shortest span of time. So with that is that it's true, we need to also pull up our socks, as you were saying, but also look in terms of how can we empower the smaller municipality, how can we make the smaller towns more attractive so that we can actually minimize this exposure to Windhoek as well. Because in most cases, as the last findings was, that people coming through here, there are people in Windhoek that are actually disadvantaged because of this, because they are not getting the homes that they need, and because other people are taking it from them. So one needs to also take that into account as well. Make the smaller towns attractive, and with that comes the PPPs. If we collaborate, and if this is a national problem, it's not just a Windhoek issue.
Okay, do we have any other questions from the public? I think Councillor Governors. And Scraver, you had your hand up in that order.
Good morning, all present here. Good morning and welcome, Charmill. I just wanted to ask, in terms of the, thank you. If you look at the Economic Development Department and Public Welfare, do you think that local authorities alone are responsible for the social welfare of the residents within its local boundary? And what do you think should happen in terms of that responsibility to be decentralized? What do you think? What's your input on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. In terms of centralizing that, is going to be a challenge if one just took into the nutshell in terms of social development in itself, because it's very broad and there are different line ministries that works with this type of thing. I think the best option or the best way forward is shareholder engagement. That is really, really critical in terms of finding out what is the needs that we have, rather than just assuming what those needs are and then acting on them, but really acting and genuinely looking in terms of what is the need out there and how can we actually assist in that regard.
Just a follow-up. The social responsibilities such as emergency services, for example, and the city police, do you think that a local authority should carry that cost alone?
That's a tough one in the sense that currently now residents are actually paying for the city of for those type of services in terms of utilities and so on, because there was a fee on it. So I think, in a nutshell, one would want to understand how did it come to that specific amount was then charged to residents, and how is it enough to start off with? And that's why I was saying stakeholder engagement is really, really critical, because if you understand the need, you'll be able to put a number to it, to say this is how much we need, this is what we need, and this is how we're going to go about it. But if you just walk in a vacuum, you will just also just you'll be lost in that sense. So in order to centralize it, I think that is going to take a while. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Charmill. I might have missed it, but in your own words, I want you to tell us how you feel about corruption, first and foremost. And within the mandate of the CEO, there are certain instruments that allows the CEO to fight corruption. Can you just maybe just zoom in as to how you will use these instruments to fight corruption? But what I want to hear is you as a person. What is it that you will do as a person, you yourself as the CEO, to fight corruption within the scope of the mandated of the instruments that are put there for the CEO? Because I've listened to you, and but I haven't heard. I might have missed it. But the issue of corruption, within, yeah, you can just.
The issue of corruption is something that should not actually be allowed, but I mean, we in Africa, and we know for a fact that is happening. And from a personal perspective, I believe that one needs to have integrity. One needs to work within the realm of what is fair and what is right, irrespective of if somebody is watching or not. And also, if you put structures in place, that in itself, not just governance, but just structures in place where people are held accountable, where this type of transactions is transparent to everybody, you minimize corruption in that sense. And if it has to come that you suspect that there are avenues that one can go through, I mean, we've got the ACC, we've got forensic audits in place. So, I mean, those are also measures to kind of counter corruptions in that regard.
Just a follow-up.
Yes, Councillor.
You mentioned putting up structures to fight corruption. I'm sure you have read up on City of Windhoek. You have read up on what the CEO is allowed, the mandate of the CEO, and so forth. Can you just mention one of the structures, one of the many things that you would bring in as a new CEO to fight corruption? Perhaps in terms of structures, or what you will do as a new CEO within the mandate of the CEO to fight corruption.
One of the structures, going back to, there we go, is if you streamline your processes and you understand what is the mandate that we're supposed to do. This is a service organization. What does it take for you to be able to provide that service? And stakeholder involvement is very important, because if people know what it is that you're doing, and within departments as well, if employees knows what's happening at a certain department, I think you, in a way, you'll be able to minimize it by a big chunk, in terms of everybody knows what is expected, what is happening, and the tenders that have come in, or whatever services that is required, at what point, and who has the authority to actually make that call. Because in most cases, one has seen that the corruption actually kind of come from the bottom up. And people that you don't suspect to have the power are the ones that actually have that kind of information. So if one can limit that, it would be really great in terms of structures.
Thank you. Your Worship.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Zamuee. There was a survey done by the organization. It was called a culture survey. It tried to understand the nature of this place. What are the issues? What are the problems? And I had an opportunity to read that, the culture survey, because it allowed me to enter into the psychology, not only of the employee, but also of the institution. But it also collaborated the views that I've always had about the city of Windhoek. That is the inability of the city over the past 10 years to have stability. Councillors are not full-time. People think they are full-time, but we don't have executive mayors or people. They're not in the office all the time. That leaves the chief executive officer as a key person, like the person who must watch the house in terms of what should happen. One of the tendencies that has happened over the past and continues to happen is the ability of staff members to convert themselves into councillors. In other words, the interface and the creation of factions. So in other words, the lines are blurred. So you as a chief executive officer, you are here, you must now account to your board. In other words, in our setting, the councillors are some sort of board, but your subordinates are already in collusion with some of your bosses. And that has created a serious instability to an extent that the president unsuccessfully attempted to intervene where councillors and the official had a meeting at State House, which might have just been a weakness of the leadership. How would you, as a chief executive officer, ensure that there is some sort of integrity maintained in dealing with this culture where the bosses or the boards are somehow compromised in terms of this allegiance? Because you are there at the center. So I'm giving a real life scenario that if you are successful, you are likely to face, and it would be interesting to see how you would respond, just to make sure that there is integrity and something like that doesn't happen where factions are created under your watch by either your subordinate. Now you will have your subordinate together with your boss, and then you are in the middle there as a CEO. I hope it's.
Thank you. That one, it's one of two things. The one is we are protected by the same constitution, and we act in terms of the local authority acts, and with that, I will have full responsibility for employees and accountability to the council. So with that, it means that one is to then hold council also accountable for their action in terms of how they engage. I mean, it's one or two things, depending on the nature of the transgression, because you need to have your house in act, and we've got the Labor Act as well that will act as a guide in terms of things like that, because employees have a scope, they've got a job description in terms of what they need to do, and one needs to help them accountable within that realm with their job description.
Thank you.
And also counting on council support to minimize those type of things. Because one, if you amplify things like that and you highlight things like that, you actually kind of put them in a point where it becomes invisible, not invisible, but you kind of, it disappears in the sense that it's no longer valid because it's amplified and everybody can see it. So you minimize those and mitigate those type of risks.
Thank you. Ms. Zamuee, we have a question from a member of the public via Facebook, and it comes from A1 Kunjeni Ihemba, and he asks, what is your strategy in curbing the high cost of services in the city?
Thank you. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, that's one of the things. The first 100 days, what one needs to do is to climatize and to really understand every aspect of the city. And that is also something that I personally has struggled with or had an issue with in terms of the cost. And one need to really understand where it's coming from. Is it because of third parties that the city has actually engaged in, or is it just a mere cost increment type of thing? And one needs to then deviate from that, because I mean, we're all struggling. So I mean, what other avenues is there that the city can actually generate income rather than having to get that from the residents? So we need to really capitalize on what is in our basket, what is at our disposal, and how can we best actually make use of those type of avenues to generate more money for the city, and therefore kind of alleviate these additional charges on the end consumer. Because in the end, you ask yourself this question: even if you have to increase the service, does that really add anything, any value to the consumer in the end? So is it justified? And does it really add value in that sense? So one needs to really have a full picture in terms of how and why is it that the city has decided on those type of strategies. And I think understanding will actually give one perspective in terms of what is the next point of action.